Good morning, gentlemen. Wonderful weather. I'm going to talk about Russia and communism. Communist theory actually was propounded by Karl Marx, and he was later helped by one of his associates. His name was Engels, and both of them went together and had what they wanted to say put in a volume called Das Kapital. It's written in German, but Marx was a Jew and a German. And he came at a time when there was an industrial revolution in Europe. The workers were not being looked after, and the capitalists were making money. The timing was correct as far as this theory is concerned, but Marx tried to generalize it for eternity, and that is where he failed. Russia, as you know, was ruled by the Tsars. They were autocrats in the extreme, in the sense that they believed in imperialistic power, and at the same time they relied on their power on the landowners and the army and certain races like the Cossacks. The mass of the farmers were generally downtrodden. They were serfs. They had not much of life of their own, and they were at the mercy of the landowners. Their daughters and wives were at the mercy of the owner of the land. If he liked anybody, he just took them away, slept with them, made them pregnant, sent them away. It was a terrible life for the peasants. But at the same time, the Russians had their own form of imperialism. The Tsars must be given credit for having expanded the Russian Empire. They expanded it all over, and it started off from Finland down to Kazakhstan, Central Asia, Siberia. Everywhere the Tsars expanded and made the Russian Empire one of the biggest in the world. We cannot deny that credit to the Tsars, that they made the Russian Empire. Unfortunately, the Tsar dynasty didn't keep pace with the time. That's the problem. Russia became the laggard of Europe, and though there were men like Peter the Great who wanted to modernize Russia, but they did not succeed. And matters were not compounded by the Russian ruling elite always working in cahoots with the monarchies of England and other countries, because they had blood relations also. And net result of all this was that they always entered a war on the side of the British and the French. And in World War II and in World War I, they did the same thing. They came on the side of the Allies, and they were roundly defeated by the Germans, because the Russian army was ill-equipped. There was no strategy, the economy was poor. These were the breeding grounds of nationalism in Russia, and the Communist Party, or as we call the Bolshevik Party, they took control of this entire scenario and started a revolution against Russia, against the Tsar. Now the Tsar had his failures, that's why I told you, and probably that's why he failed. If he had read the signs properly, not got into a war with Germany, concentrated on his home front in improving the nutrition of the people, the food, etc., he would survive longer, and Russia would still have had a monarchy like they have in Japan and England. But it didn't happen that way in Russia. There was a revolution, the Tsar was overthrown, and though for some time a small group came into power called the Mensheviks, who wanted the Tsar, but they were also overthrown by Lenin, who was the Bolshevik leader, and a communist dictatorship was established in Russia in 1917 by what is known as the famous October Revolution. Now this revolution drew its inspiration from the theories of Karl Marx, but that's about all. Marx had created a utopia, but that utopia could not be created in Russia by Lenin. He tried, but he realized the limitations of communism. And maybe he would have tempered it if he had lived longer, but he died in 1924. And during that period, he did something very, very drastic and bad for Russia. He was the first man, along with Trotsky, who introduced the concentration camps, number one. Number two, he started collectivization of agriculture and industry, thinking that this is what Marx meant when he talked of dictatorship of the proletariat. Actually, Marx has got a much wider meaning than just a literal meaning which Lenin took. And Lenin died, and then we had Stalin coming into power. And on him was the onus on his shoulders to hold the mighty Russian Empire together, and he did it with an iron hand. He started a 5-year plan, got some economic progress, but in the process wiped out millions, alienated so many people. He was a great man to a degree that so long as he was in power, he not only won the war against Germany, but he made Russia into a power to reckon with, and the Americans were scared of Russia at that time, so long as Stalin was alive. Though I will say Stalin never followed communism the way Marx wanted it, but he had his own brand of it, and somehow he carried on, and Russia did move forward. It was his work, his goading of the scientific community that led to the development of the long-range bombers like the Bear, which became an existentialist threat for America. At the same time, Stalin died in 1953, leaving behind the Soviet Empire, but after his death, there was no man capable to take over. And then the limitations of the communist theory came into being. So in a way, I will say that communism was not really a good thing for Russia. That is one thing we must remember. Communism caused the downfall of Russia because for the next 40 years after the death of Stalin, the Soviet state, that is the USSR, the largest empire in world history, collapsed. An empire built up by the Tsars with such meticulous care to further Russian power in Central Asia and Southern Asia went down like a stone in the ocean. That's the point to be noted. So if we consider these facts, I think communism in Russia was a bad period for Russia, in the sense that the mighty Soviet Empire, the Russian Empire, which was built by the Tsar, broke up, finished, over. And only a rump, that is the Russian state, was left. Even in Europe, Ukraine voted to separate from the USSR. It became an independent country, and so did small countries like Moldavia and others. They all left the USSR, including the Baltic states, which had been part of the Soviet Union. Now, one man who facilitated all this was Gorbachev. I don't think he really understood what communism was, what it means to control such a big empire. After all, how did the Mughals control one of the biggest empires in world history? That was with the sword, with a threat. And you can't hold an empire without that. And this is where Gorbachev failed. I remember reading a book that Gorbachev was actually a CIA agent, but that's not true. I mean, that's a fanciful thought. One can only say he was incompetent, who couldn't understand what history is. What Russia needed at that time was the reform of communism, not to do away with communism and the so-called glasnost or petroska, which had been set up by Brezhnev and later by Gorbachev, should not have been followed. So net result of communism is that it has a negative contribution as far as Russia is concerned. It reduced the status of Russia from a global power to a regional power, very bad. Number two, it became an alien state to even its old colonies. Members of the Warsaw Pact countries were not ready to go with Russia because of the ills which were done during communist rule. Now look at Ukraine. In 1935-31, Stalin had decided that he wanted to collectivize agriculture. Most of the Soviet Russia agreed, but Ukrainian peasants resisted. And instead of trying to persuade them, Stalin took the easier path out. He stopped the export of food grains to Ukraine from other parts And as far as the Ukraine granary is concerned, which was the granary of Europe and Russia, all the grain was taken away and used somewhere else or exported out, and the Ukrainians were left with nothing, and it was what we call the man-made induced famine. How many died? Nobody knows. Maybe from 2 to 8 million. But my estimate is about 4 to 5 million died of hunger. And that has left its eternal scar on Ukraine-Russia relations. Same thing the Russians did in a different way in Poland. When they got 3,000 Polish officers executed, when Stalin told them to carry out a revolution and the Russian army will come, and he stopped the Russian army from moving into Poland, and the Germans were able to execute 3,000 Polish soldiers and officers. It was a betrayal. They also betrayed Japan. They had a peace pact signed, and the height of the crisis, when even the Germans had declared war on the United States, Russia never attacked Japan and honored a peace with them. And that's what happened. But once the war was coming over and Japan was defeated, they just moved in. They took vast areas of Manchuria under their control, and all the Japanese weapons were captured and handed over to the communists in China. That's Mao Zedong. And net result was that Chiang Kai-shek was defeated, who were the lackey of the Americans, a yes man. So he ran away to Formosa. So this just shows that the Russians had a very short-sighted global policy. They didn't know what way to go forward. And communism, I will say, was the wagon which propelled Russia to this doom. So people who talk of communism and wish to profess communist faith in other countries must beware. Communism is just an idealistic thought, a utopia which cannot be realized. And putting Marx in the category of the great thinkers like Aristotle or others is a fallacy. He was a man with a limited horizon whose theory was only valid during the period of the Industrial Revolution. And what Marx wrote was more applicable. He wanted it to apply to Germany, France and England, not Russia, because Russia is not an industrial state. But it got applied in Russia and China, of all places. And in Russia it was corrupted, made into something else, into a totalitarian state, more reminiscent of what Orwell wrote in his book 1984, where Big Brother looks over you. Gentlemen, this brief video is just to tell you that the communism is not a good thing. And even those communists who are in India must realize that their time is up. They'll never come to power in India. And communism should never come to power in any country because they cannot understand the vortex of history. And it's a sad commentary that the Communist Party in Russia did bring about the revolution, overthrew the Tsar, but that was nihilism. That's something called nihilism, destruction, bringing down the civilization. And in the bargain, in the end, they have destroyed the mighty Tsarist empire. I don't think there's any credit for communism, and we must bear that in mind. I close now, gentlemen. I hope you like this small video. Today's New Year's Eve. I'm going to have a jolly good time. I hope so. So about you. And I will say goodbye and farewell. Look after yourself. Subscribe to my channel. Share it with your friends. I hope you do that. God bless. Jai Hind. Glory to India.